Richard Cooke, thank you very, very much for joining the Centre for Media Transition.
My pleasure.
What are the rules for editing on Wikipedia?
Um, the the rules about conflict of interest editing are that you are not supposed to edit or start a page about yourself. Um, you're not supposed to receive compensation for writing on or for Wikipedia, and you're not supposed to write a page for an organization that you have a link with, that you're employed with, that you campaign for. That rule's a little bit blurrier, but it's still there. And enforcement is difficult. You know, this sort of editing does go on. It's not something where it's so easy always to identify it. But when it is identified, people will usually try and do something about it.
Is it difficult to police or is it impossible to police?
I think that it would be very difficult to police. I mean, the enforcement, except in rare cases where people might be kicked off, is usually just to flag stuff for deletion or to flag the issue that there has been some conflict of interest editing.
So Wikipedia has had, lots of ups and downs over its time in terms of controversies. But it would seem that the possibility of being a resource to actually peddle misinformation and disinformation is actually quite high. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical of misinformation and disinformation as terms. I think that they tend to be very broad umbrella terms, which encompass a whole lot of different things, some of which are not very strongly related to each other. The other issue is that, as Wikipedia often says itself, it's not intended to be a source, it's a collection of sources. And the difference between disinformation, if we're going to use that term, on Wikipedia and disinformation somewhere else is that you can usually see where it originated from or if it has no citations or no sourcing.
But you have to be looking for it, right? You have to be actually acutely looking for a source that might not be a good source or information that might be bad information.
It depends what the topic is. So there are different rules for different topics. Biographies of living persons on Wikipedia have more stringent sourcing requirements than other types of pages. So a biography will usually have a better quality of sourcing than other types of articles. But yeah, I mean, you always have to be looking at everything on the internet to try and determine its provenance and accuracy.
So,
Wikipedia is no exception to that.
so you think then that the chances of kind of catching misinformation or disinformation or bad information full stop is easier on Wikipedia because of the ability to source who has created an edit.
Yeah, I think that it can be audited more easily because of you can determine the authorship. Sometimes there are anonymous editors allowed, but you can tell something of their provenance because their IP address will be recorded. But in articles of good quality, pretty much every line should have a citation to a media organization or another source where you can have a sort of, you can weigh up how accurate it's likely to be. And that's pretty unusual online. Very few sources of information have that level of sourcing.
But of course, sourcing back to a media organisation is no guarantee of accuracy, is it?
Absolutely not. No, and depending on the media organization, there are fairly mainstream media organizations like the Daily Mail that have been banned on Wikipedia because of repeat inaccuracies, for example.
Right. So, do you think that the current model permits any chance of some of those possibilities or openings for misinformation, disinformation to sneak through to be totally eliminated?
No, absolutely not. I mean, there is no way that the nature of the internet generally and Wikipedia in particular means that trying to eradicate misinformation or disinformation is impossible. That's the cost of things being prolific and having very, very large quantities of information. Um, so there might be ways that they can be improved by things like sort of mutual enforcement, but eradication altogether is impossible.
Explain mutual enforcement to us.
Well, it's not. That's not a term of art or a term that Wikipedia uses. That's just my summary of how these things get picked up. So there have been tools created in the past, for example, um, which have combed through Wikipedia and picked up where edits have come from in geographical terms. So, for example, if pages about the CIA are being edited from Langley, Virginia, in the United States, which is the headquarters of the CIA, then the likelihood is, and sometimes this can be, confirmed, are that people within those organizations are editing, making those kind of conflict of interest edits. This has happened repeatedly for political campaigns. It's happened for during campaigns for things like Supreme Court justices. This is, a now phenomenon which has been recognised and made transparent for decades. So continuing those sorts of efforts, illuminating them, and creating a social penalty for them is an enforcement mechanism.
Well, in fact, the reason that we're talking today is because the Australian ran a news item last week in which it highlighted edits that had been made to the page of the Teal Independent, who was elected in the federal election, Zoe Daniel. Whilst the newspaper didn't claim that this was there was anything untoward with this, it was pointing out that it had been flagged by Wikipedia as a problem. What did you make of that one?
Yeah, so that was made by an editor who had been identified and I believe banned for a practice called sock puppeting, which is creating multiple accounts so that if one gets kicked off, others can continue, or that those can reinforce each other's work in conversations and debates, for example. I mean, this is conflict of interest editing. If someone works for a political campaign and they make edits and those edits are biased, then that is a conflict of interest. This seems to be a relatively mild kind. Um, it's not paid editing work, for example. It's not removing or adding defamatory material to opponents in the political campaign, for example. Those sorts of things might rise to a level of greater concern, but it's worth flagging. Is it a national news story? I'm not sure.
Richard, thank you very, very much for your time.
My pleasure, Monica. Thank you.